Hello, and welcome again to another episode of the Future of Funding podcast. Today's guest we have with us Loic van Cutsem, a friend of mine and co-mentor and co-evaluator for various projects around the world. Loic, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Maybe I can pass across to you to give us a little bit more information and detail about your background, what you're working on, and something exciting that's coming up in the near future.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Rizwan. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Really look forward to our conversation. And as you mentioned, yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to be working together in different ways and forms in different contexts since several years now. So my name is Loic. Indeed, I have a background in initially in kind of corporate sustainability, but since 10, 15 years now, I guess, more in the social entrepreneurship field, both as a co-founder, but mainly as an intermediary, supporting social entrepreneurs, NGOs, whether they're at an early stage or more advanced kind of scaling stage, to scale their impact. That takes different types of support, but that's basically what I do. And today I'm a consultant in the impact field, so working for different impact ventures, both in the kind of biodiversity nature field and in the energy and education field. And I also work for a couple foundations, just like you do as well, helping them figure out the best funding strategy, how to best support grantees, or doing due diligence on grantees, things like that.
Yeah, and I guess that means that you've had a pretty good insight into quite a wide range of nonprofits. That's the difference between talking to someone that has founded and run a nonprofit for a long time. They've got an experience of one context. The advantage of the kind of work that you and I do is that we have a good insight into many contexts. And certainly the fact that your background with Ashoka would have brought you into contact with a lot of real grassroots projects and their challenges with funding and fundraising. And as an intermediary, you get to sit in between finance and execution while supporting execution and also sometimes supporting finances. So I think your insights will be really useful to get that slightly broader perspective of the patterns in what works and doesn't work and how the funding should look like in the future. So before we move on, though, anything exciting that's in the near pipeline for you coming up?
Yeah, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. One is this impact venture called biodiversity is now really scaling internationally. So lots of exciting new partnerships. That's a lot of fun. Lots of challenges as well, but a lot of fun. And then some exciting new projects related to supporting foundations to reach another level of supporting their grantees and providing non-financial support and things like that. So yeah, exciting work ahead.
All right, great. So today's conversation, actually, we probably look to major mostly on the future of funding. But I think why don't we have a quick run through of your personal experiences and the experiences that you've encountered while working with other organizations in terms of what you found to be particularly helpful in terms of generating, amplifying, supporting impact in terms of money.
Yeah, super. Yeah, a couple things probably. First, I mean, and some of this may sound very basic, but still remains very important, I feel. I'd start with really initially in the process, kind of the way that funders communicate on their funding goals, strategy, topics. And I think it definitely helps a lot when you're applying for new funding, applying for grants, etc., to find clear information on what is the strategy of the funder, ideally, what is kind of their theory of change, what are they trying to achieve, which type of organizations are they supporting, at which stages of maturity, in which context, in which geography. So transparent communication upfront is, I find, very helpful.
How often do you find that funders have the answers to these things?
It depends. I think all the answers rarely, but I do see differences in the ways they communicate. Some tend to be more transparent, clear. They may not have all the answers. They may not have a very clear theory of change, for example, things like that, although some do. But there's clearly a difference I see in how much information they put out there and how transparently it's communicated, which I find super helpful because it allows you as a nonprofit or a social entrepreneur looking for those types of fundings to filter out, which is the homework everyone should be doing
Yeah.
first out.
To give you a chance to apply your own basic due diligence on the funder to check whether or not you're likely to be a fit for that fund rather than finding out only at the end of the process that you never really were a fit at all.
Yeah, exactly. So clarity on their strategy, their focus areas, but also clarity on their process, their selection criteria, their timeline. And I like it a lot when I can see examples of other projects they've been supporting and the impact they're having together. So I would say that's one aspect that is really helpful.
Yeah, so effectively giving the nonprofit something useful to work with before they begin, so they can either filter themselves out without wasting too much time, or they can genuinely align themselves or ensure that what they're doing and what the fund is doing is well aligned and follow that through all the way through their application process. I wonder if you also see it as reflected in the quality of the RFPs that get put out or the questionnaires, proposal forms, in terms of the nature of the questions that are asked and how comprehensible, or not repeated is not the right term, but where the same question is being asked in four different ways.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a great segue to the next point. I think, the application process or the RFPs, it's useful when they're fit for purpose. So what I mean by that is, if they're offering small grants, kind of 1 year small grants, I don't want to fill in a 50-page document, and it just doesn't make sense. And I'm still have to do this a lot. So whereas if we're looking for kind of a long-term, 3, 5, maybe 7-year funding for significant amounts, of course, I'm willing and will invest the time to provide much more insights. And that makes a lot of sense. But I think there's still, adapting. That's a message probably more for funders, but adapting your application or RFP process to the size, the scale, the context of what you're potentially offering. There's nothing worse than spending hours filling in a long questionnaire for ultimately, if all goes well, 10K, 6 month funding kind of thing.
I mean, it's one of these things where it's almost you have to laugh. As a listener, if you're not familiar with the context, you'd imagine that, well, this would be so obvious and we must be exaggerating when you bring up a point like this, but it's really not the case. By looking at an RFP, you really most often could never correlate it with the size of the money. Sometimes you have very large funds that have very simple RFPs, very effective, and take you straight into a much more productive diligence process. And then you've got some very small grants that have wildly complicated RFPs. And going back to the point I made earlier, one of the trickiest things that I've encountered, both as an executor and as a mentor for nonprofits, is when they are faced with a question that's essentially asking the same thing in different words. And you're at a loss because you're like, well, I'm sure I've already answered. Do I repeat the same thing? I can't repeat the same thing. So now I've got to find another way of saying it.
Just quickly, it's a bit of a detail, but I found it an interesting good practice that I've experienced applying for a grant. It was not too long. And then they invited people to an interview. And I mean, it sounds again very basic and simple, but it doesn't happen often to have the opportunity to have a bit of FaceTime with the potential selection jury. Makes, I feel, a big difference. You can, you get a feel of, first of all, of who's in front of you and whether that's a good fit or not. If you kind of share the same values or not, it comes up quite quickly in the conversation. And it allows to have a much more interactive, clarify maybe questions or points they didn't understand and vice versa. So simple thing, but it doesn't happen often. Usually you fill in your form. It takes a lot of time. You send it through. Worst case, you never hear back. Best case, you hear back. Well, sorry, but it was a long process. We had many applicants. We didn't take you. So having some FaceTime, which really I think is very valuable for the selection jury as well, having 5-10 minutes with the potential grantees to see who's behind it.
So we're talking about diligence beyond paperwork, right? Do you have an opinion on that more widely than just the one interview?
Yeah. So precisely, I think, the paperwork is one thing, but for me, the quality of due diligence should be in interviews, in FaceTime, but also discussions with other stakeholders involved, perhaps in the project, right? Not only with the founder or the team, but also getting as many perspectives as possible from beneficiaries, partners, implementation partners,
Especially when you're
stakeholders.
looking at scaled up organizations or organizations that are planning to scale, because their partners are just as important in the decision. Because if they aren't, in fact, bought in, or they don't know what this is all about, or they're not, in fact, as capable even as the primary organization, the likelihood of that scale up or the impact remaining effective is fundamentally compromised if the partners are not as effective or is not as competent as the main organization that you're giving your money to.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, great. What else in terms of good practices?
Yeah, so then I'd say if we come to the grant as such, I definitely, and again, it may sound basic, but a good practice remains it's not only about the finance or the money, it's a lot about the non financial support that you may receive, whether this is, access to mentoring or coaching, whether this is access to potential partners, whether this is visibility, whether this is peer support and kind of joining a community of peers and peer learning. So I find there's often as much, if not more, value in the non-financial support than the grant itself. And this again depends probably on the maturity of the organization. If I had to make a simple maybe equation, I would probably say that the less mature the organization, the more important the non-financial support is as opposed to the financial one. And that equation probably changes a bit as the project becomes more mature.
I think there's a very good point in that, because for organizations and teams that are already very competent, when you try and provide especially developmental support to them, they end up just having to go through the motions and feeling like time is just being wasted and lost. But when you come down to organizations that aren't quite as competent already, but are doing good work, then it's a game changer, not so much in their competence, but certainly in their morale. They really find it personally enriching for the leaders, for the teams. That support does more than just improve their ability to execute.
Absolutely. They're often very bootstrapped, overworked, have very few people who they can spare. I totally agree. It's not only kind of development skills and organization skills that one can bring in, but also basically a buffer, a breathing space, someone to spare with, someone to reflect, and someone to support you through this journey, which, as we know, can be very, very challenging when you're in the early stages of setting up an NGO or social enterprise.
In terms of morale, when you're doing this work, you rarely feel appreciated by your system or ecosystem or people you know, and it does take a toll on you. So, yeah, having that support can play quite a big role in how good you feel about yourself and what you do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's so important. We're seeing, I mean, it's another topic, but the whole issue around well being and burnout in this sector is such a big one. So I think these are all interventions that can mitigate and prevent a bit
That goes
those
back to
risks.
your point about non-financial support around mentoring, right? Like mentoring plays such a valuable role in a scenario like this because it does both those things. It really helps with the resilience and how people feel and their motivation and morale, while also improving their capability and their capacity and so on. As a mentor, how have you found this when you're working with nonprofits?
So there are different experiences. In some cases, it takes a bit of time to create that trust relationship. You know, maybe they haven't yet experienced mentoring, so they may be a bit reluctant, but worried or curious to see how is this going to work. In other cases, they've been through other coaching or mentoring programs and they're a bit more confident. But building trust is anyway a crucial part of the recipe up front. And then indeed, I think it's just showing up and asking the right questions and just being there, listening a lot as well. And as you say, it's not only about kind of the technical skills and the specific organizational elements, but it's often a lot about the person that you're working with. Funders should definitely be core and close partners and at the same level as grantees. So no power dynamics or avoid them as much as possible and really be there as partners and supporters and offering these listening spaces. Yeah, I think at some points there may be a bit of conflicts of interest. I mean, it's different roles. There's still the funder, so you may need to bring in other types of more neutral people. But I think the funder should be very close to their grantees and be there for them, listen and adapt along the way. And I think we're both involved in working with some foundations where they, for instance, have bi-monthly review meetings. It's hosted by external people. But these are spaces where, yeah, challenges can be discussed. Progress, of course, can be discussed.
So effectively, you're creating a triangulation there, right? It's not a direct one-to-one anymore. You're creating almost an intermediation that allows a bit more space and breathing room and manages the power dynamics in a healthy way between yourself and the nonprofit because now there's an intermediary. If they're set up badly, then of course that intermediary is just an extension of yourself as the power player. But if you do bring on people that are ex-practitioners or people who really have a deep-rooted history in caring for impact and delivering impact, and they tend to do a pretty good job of acting as a functional intermediary, which gives a lot of value, I think, both for the nonprofit and for the funder.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely agree. Obviously, I have to mention the kind of good practice or what helped me, the long-term perspective, which is still also rare in this field. It's very often 1 year, maybe renewable, but 1 year kind of grants. So anything a bit more long-term, anything a bit flexible is definitely extremely helpful.
What do you think is a sensible, when you say long term, I don't mean necessarily as a grant commitment, but a commitment in terms of how long you should really be supporting organizations or projects? What's a minimum sensible timeline, do you think, for us to be able to actually generate and see impact?
Yeah. Well, change doesn't happen overnight, right? It's non-linear, unpredictable. Certainly, if you really want to address the root causes of a problem, it's 10, 15, 20 years minimum type of work at the system level.
It's so important that you say that. And That's why I asked the question. I feel like as practitioners and as a real world of executors, what we look at as the minimum timeline, you said 10, 15, 20 years. We're so far away from what the funding ecosystem thinks of as a maximum timeline of 3 years. I think to me, that is the crux of the biggest disconnect between finance and execution.
Yeah, I completely agree, which doesn't mean that, a particular funder needs to be providing funding during 10, 15, 20 years, but the whole system should be articulated with that timeline in mind. And then it can be adapted to the specificities of the funder, the maturity level of the project. It can be a combination of funding, non-financial support, new funders can come in, but there's no change, no deep change, no systems level change that can happen in less than 15 years.
And I guess the crux under that is that as a funder, if you really want your financing to result in impact, then there's an onus on you to ensure continuity or ensure that it's being set up for continuity as compared to just doing what everybody else is doing now, which is just turning up for a small time frame of that and then assuming that, well, it's the non-profit's problem to ensure continuity. You get what I mean? You've got to find the next 3 year funder and then the 3 year funder after that, and then the 1 year in the middle. And for us, we're just interested in what we do in the 3 years, and then if it continues after, it continues. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And I feel like that sense of recognizing the timelines it takes is so critical because, like you said, you don't have to be the funder for the whole time frame. But once you select organizations, you really should be selecting ones that you feel confident to support over the next decade if they meet all of their commitments, rather than looking at ones that you're confident to support for the next 3 years and then you know that you're going to find another player.
Yeah, absolutely. Crucial. I agree.
Any other points in the good practices arena that jump out at you?
Yeah, when it comes to defining kind of the whole so-called MEL monitoring, evaluation, learning, the reporting requirements kind of thing, that can also be very cumbersome. And again, it should be fit for purpose. If it's a small grant, you shouldn't be asking much and maybe more. But one experience I've had, and which I think should be systematically done, is that the donor did not impose the KPIs on us, but asked us, kind of said, okay, well, you guys are the experts actually in this field. What are the key metrics that you would like to track? And of course, there were conversations, interactions, but we co-created the metrics and the framework together, which I think, again, perhaps sounds very basic to the listeners, but it's still something that is not happening enough. Very often the funders come with their framework, they put it on you, it creates power dynamics, and you end up monitoring and tracking stuff that you don't really want to be tracking, and it just brings your resources and attention to something that is not actually what you should be doing necessarily.
I think if funders were genuinely coming in with high competence in that domain, or the funding team was built up from people that have all got histories of executing for that demographic in that domain, then it's hardly going to feel onerous for the nonprofit when whatever is being provided as a framework clearly fits. And as you know, most executors actually welcome being pushed and challenged to do better and to think better. And I think that's the nuance in this point here, right? Which is that it's not that common that funders will, in fact, arrive with deep domain experience in their teams and in their design proposition. That's when it becomes a real problem, that you have that arbitrary requirements that you have to find a way to accommodate. And there isn't a two-way dialogue that really even allows you to say, well, I don't think this is particularly going to be helpful. This is just going to suck up resources that achieves very little.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this is a key barrier, a key challenge in the field today.
Well, I guess that leads us neatly into the next piece of this, right? Which is, what are the practices that you encounter that you've seen to be very unhelpful in enabling impact, to the point of really inhibiting it or holding it back, or demoralizing teams?
Well, it's a lot of the opposites of the ones I mentioned earlier, obviously. But there's definitely something to build on what we were saying around power dynamics. This is not helpful. If you feel there's a lack of trust from the funder, if you feel not in a genuine space, but more in a controlling space and trying to influence you to deliver KPIs that their board needs to see, those kind of things, that's really unpleasant and unhealthy and just unsustainable.
Why do you think we don't have, or the impact sector doesn't have, an intermediating system like consumer rights body or an ombudsman? Or why do you think we don't have that yet, where nonprofits can hold funders accountable?
It's a very interesting question. I've never thought about it that way, actually, to be honest. I don't have a direct answer, but it's a really relevant question.
Because we talk about power dynamics, but all the narrative or the paradigm is very much the power player needs to, avoid flexing their muscles by choice versus the reality of it, which is that no one has yet set up any mechanism of accountability. And it's a good question as to why, when we have plenty of equivalent examples where imbalances in power dynamics are in fact addressed by systems as compared to by encouraging people to do better.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. I love the idea. I don't know why we don't have that yet, actually. Do you have any insights or thoughts on that? I think it's just a brilliant idea. And you're right. I mean, this is one way to prevent such practices in other sectors, and it's proven to work. So why not? You're right.
I think it's a paradigm problem. We have some norms that we've all kind of settled into. And a lot of the discussion around improvements or changes are all incremental adjustments within the boxes of those paradigms. It's a little bit like you were talking earlier, a previous paradigm we discussed is time frame, right? The current paradigm is very much, well, 3 years is a long time. So all our adjustments and thought processes and even vision and planning, etc., is all very much about how can we do better inside this 3 year time frame, but obviously we can't go beyond the 3 years. That's not up for debate. When in fact, you know perfectly well that no functional impact planning can really operate. 10 years would be the minimum timeline that we need to be seeing for any kind of effective change. So this is, I think, when you say why, that's one of them. It's just it's never been there. And then you have the problem of, well, who's going to set it up and who's going to finance it, right? And that again comes down to the issue where if funders don't take the lead on setting some of these things up, then when does a nonprofit decide to? I think it'll hopefully come. Some of these conversations will start to lead in that direction. Maybe one of our contributions to the world is beginning to open up that particular can of worms. But it is an important piece. The more I have these conversations with guests, the more it stands out to me because everybody makes the same point about power dynamics and everybody's point still uses the same foundation piece, which is, well, funders need to be mindful of their power in the system as compared to having a system that holds funders accountable in the same way as the system is able to hold nonprofits accountable. Regulation is not necessarily harmful. Regulation, if set up well, the systems are set up well, are a game changer in outcomes, in effectiveness, in longevity, in resilience, as compared to just being a burden, or red tape. So there's that useful balance, which is where consumers is the best example. Or you go to a country where there's a functioning consumer rights bureau or system. Any shop that you buy stuff from will have a 30-day return policy. If something is damaged or something is broken, you don't worry as a consumer. Their whole business model and everything is set up to just accommodate that. But you go to countries around the world, especially a lot of global south countries where none of this exists, there's no trust possible between the buyer and the seller. So effectively, the buyer is always at the mercy of the seller. And I think that's a little bit of where we are.
It's a great point. And as you mentioned, in the end, it's about creating trust. Yeah. And that definitely is one mechanism to do so.
Yeah, and it's a healthy mechanism to do so. Then you get good practices, you get good funders that survive and thrive. And then the ones that can't, that don't want to do those things, they get weeded out of the system as they should be. And overall, you just get a much better trust across the whole ecosystem. And nonprofits feel more comfortable to say what needs to be said. And you would just get a jump in quality of general practice and effectiveness, or at least you would expect to. That's a discussion for another time. But I was curious as to whether you had an opinion on why we haven't seen it yet. Just hasn't occurred to anyone, I suppose. That's maybe
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, on our list of things to get to, Loic. All right, let's move on. Next, what else is on your view?
So I think there's also a tendency, what I've seen is kind of a funding that is not fit for purpose or not adapted to the maturity of the organization. So, for example, a foundation pushed by their board or by peers or other to kind of do scaling grants or scaling funding, which end up providing money to organizations which are not yet ready actually to scale. So again, it's unhelpful for everyone. The funder will be unpleased with the results and the organization is squeezed into doing something to reach certain indicators around scaling, although they just don't have the foundation set up for it. So it would be much wiser in that case for the funder probably to kind of have a tiered approach, make sure they're clear on what's the maturity level of the organization, what does it need? Are they ready? Are they at that stage that they can really scale? Or is it more support that they need to prepare the foundations and design for future scaling? So there's a misfit often there.
Well, there's an underlying point there that may be worth drawing out, which is by and large, organizations are not ready to scale. I think this is it's not a case of 90% of them are and 10 of them aren't, and it's really the other way around. the vast majority, certainly in my experience, and I'll pass it across to you to comment on it, of where we are providing money to scale has been provided by a player that doesn't understand scaling and therefore isn't able to recognize the difference between an organization that is doing well in its local environment and an organization that is functionally ready to scale that up. There's a big gap between those two stages.
Totally agree. I think there's also a problem or different understanding of what scale means. For some actors, scaling is still kind of, having more reach or growing your organization, while for others, scaling is about having deeper impact without necessarily growing, or on the contrary, leveraging partnerships. So there's still that piece. And I agree with you. Most projects I know and have worked with have not been designed for scale upfront at the beginning. And then they're pushed towards scale by the system, let's say. And it just doesn't work because they're not designed for it. Often it requires actually a step back, which is not easy for a funder to do, but even harder maybe for the entrepreneur, the NGO leader to do. It requires really a step back and to rethink, okay, how do I design my organization, my systems, my process, my tools, my vision, my strategy for scale, if that's what they want to do, because not everyone is necessarily meant to scale.
But then the question is, how do you survive? How do you keep financing impact in a system that expects scaling? That means if you don't proceed down that line, then eventually you're just walking into a wall, into a plateau. And then that plateau from there on is a sliding slope downwards. So you're trapped in a tricky position if you're a mid to large sized nonprofit now in terms of what your future choices are.
No, absolutely. That is a bit of a wicked problem in the way the system is set up today. It's all about scaling at some point with different definitions, with different expectations.
Yeah, another one of my guests made a really good point about this, which is linking it back to a point you made earlier about being transparent around your processes, timelines, expectations, and so on. Different funders, the fact that they have different expectations or understanding of scaling, if they're not transparent about what they are, again, you can end up with a big communication gap between the nonprofit and yourself, which you may only end up resolving very far down the diligence line, where you eventually realize that you're like talking completely different languages in terms of what you mean as scaling, and therefore that nonprofit then fails that diligence. When really, if that had been clear right up front, you could have both saved yourselves a lot of time and effort. But it's particularly demoralizing for the nonprofit at the end to find out that they were thinking of as scale and what the financiers thinking of as scale isn't the same thing. So I think that transparency, so having that clear expectation and then making that expectation clearly visible is also, I feel, very important. Is there any onus on funders, do you think, to establish a unified definition or expectation of scaling to really align with everybody else, or do you really do your own thing?
I think most of them do their own thing. I mean, let's be honest, there's a lot of competition in the funding system. So when we talk about the future of funding, I think that anything around more collaborative funding targeted to really address a specific issue and then clarify indeed your expectations, your definitions of scaling, and make sure that everyone has the same understanding is, I think, crucial.
All right. Any other on your practices of less helpful things? What would you say in your experience are funding practices that you've seen to be most demoralizing for nonprofits, teams, or their beneficiaries?
I feel like I may be repeating a bit myself, but I think the worst case is, a short-term grant, a small amount, 1 year, with lots of requirements and lots of strings behind it, where you end up spending a lot of time on reporting things that are not relevant or not fundamentally addressing the problem with no predictability. So that creates, and I've seen it in different organizations, that creates demotivation and stress, a lot of stress. And often, actually, those people or those organizations will say afterwards, well, maybe I would have been better off actually without this small short-term grant. So yeah, that's definitely a pain point.
What's particularly interesting is if you look at this for a nonprofit, it's just time prohibitive and effort prohibitive. If you have a 3 out of 10 hit rate or returns rate on applications versus receiving money, which is probably a reasonable place to be. It's very rarely going to be 10 out of 10 applications. Even if you were to raise them in 10% increments of your overall operating cost, that's a lot of applications you've got to make and manage and invest in. That's a lot of people to manage the reporting of. And, at a $2 million operating cost, you're a mid to large sized nonprofit. We're not talking about a behemoth that's got a bureaucracy and a finance team of 20 people doing this. And of course, point here is that $100,000 is kind of your average big grant. I think that maybe that's a useful caveat. It's very rare to be seeing $1 million grants, and then rarer still to then get the really big grants, the 10 million and the 20 million. So you can imagine how many funders we have to manage to be able to operate a $2 million operating cost. And when you're smaller as a fund, it's useful to have some of this context so you understand what in fact is a sensible amount of money to hand out, and then what is a sensible amount of reporting and engagement expectation for that money.
Right. And I would add to that also, that was the other point I wanted to make. What's the sensible split between kind of unrestricted funding and restricted funding? I think that's another challenge we're seeing. Most of the funding is still very restricted, so linked to a specific program. Whereas, and this depends a bit, again, on the level of maturity of the organization, but I would argue most organizations, at least in the kind of early stage, really need unrestricted funding, or at least part of the funding should be unrestricted, because they need to build their foundations, build the backbone, build the systems in order to deliver and reach impact at scale later on. And it's very hard to find still today, unrestricted funding, certainly for early stage organizations.
Two of my other guests actually had a couple of really interesting things here, which I'd be interested in your opinion on as well. So one of them talked about a middle ground between restricted funds and unrestricted funds would be something like designated funds. So the money is, let's say, restricted to a domain of outcome within your operating landscape or within your impact landscape, but you are free then to deploy it as you see fit towards that outcome. So it's a middle ground if you wanted a bit more control. And we're talking about paradigms. We currently have a paradigm where funder funds either fully unrestricted or fully operational costs or fully programmatic. But what if all funds had a standard or a gold standard or a norm, what 10% of every grant provided was specifically there to go into your reserves, unrestricted reserves. So you can build and maintain those reserves, and that just becomes a standard aspect of all funding.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I like the idea of this gold standard and having that, because it's crucial. I mean, it really is crucial. And the thing is, as opposed to kind of for-profit businesses, it's very hard for NGOs to generate that reserve pot.
And we know, as people who specialize in due diligence, that funders often expect a 6 to 9 month reserve. And the question is between your expectation of what you expect them to have, or the fact that your grant money does not in any way allow for that reserve to be established, created, built, maintained. So again, talking about gold standards, we should be looking to make sure that nonprofits have a 3-year reserve, and obviously a reserve policy that determines how it's going to be used and when it's going to be used, etc. But if everybody's grants are contributing to the setup of those reserves, then there can be a functional reserve policy that says, when it extends beyond that, then the money needs to be used for development straight away, or application or growth or whatever. But can you imagine the difference in all operational effectiveness if you had the money to accommodate funder delays and changes in circumstance or any of those things, instead of it just immediately putting your whole team and your beneficiaries at risk? Yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think that would be a game changer. I think it really is one of the crucial challenges today.
Which I guess sets up perfectly for us to talk about your vision and what you see as game changing for funding.
Yeah. That's fun. Okay. Let's stream a bit. So I think one, and we've started discussing about this obviously already, but I would like to see a clear strategy from a funder, ideally a coalition of funders, informed by real knowledge of what the sector needs. So co-designed by the experts, by the stakeholders, by the beneficiaries, and with, as we mentioned earlier, kind of a 15 to 20-year vision of how we as funders want to address the root causes of a specific sector or a specific social challenge issue. So yeah, actually, I think what I'm saying is, what's our systems change strategy as a funder, or ideally as a coalition of funders, in the long run to really change the system for good? So, and that means really looking at things. How do we shift norms? How do we transform underlying structures? How do we make sure that the necessary policy shifts happen? So it's a totally different level than the typical kind of, how do we go from 1,000 people, beneficiaries reach to 5,000.
Yeah, and it's a paradigm shift as well in two ways then, right? In terms of what you consider to be impact at scale, and the idea that we're here to fund the eradication or transformation of social issues. And talking about collaboration, if my money is not big enough to realistically do that, then I need to figure out how I collaborate with others so we network that money together. and then together design for what needs to happen at that bigger picture end. Another interesting thing that came up from one of our conversations with the previous guest was she talked about impact synchronized funding. And what on that was issue synchronized funding. So if you think about the issue, what's the timeline to impact that issue? And how do you synchronize your funding to that timeline? It's a paradigm shift in how I think funders today are still looking at nonprofits or impact, which is let's find good nonprofits to give our money to.
Absolutely. I mean, there are some pioneering actors that do think that way, but it's still a minority. I think it's crucial. And the collaboration piece, I think it's tied. I would love to see much more collaborative funders. And this can be different type of funders, potentially, individuals, foundations, governments, or even corporates coming together to collectively address an issue at scale. And it really makes sense, I think. It allows them to spread their risk, to obviously have a larger impact, but also to combine different expertise and go much deeper.
Yeah, and funders, anyone or a number of those funders can take the lead and becoming the anchor for that money. Some of them would play pioneering anchor roles. Others would just be quite happy to put their money into it. I think we have to be careful that we don't end up with 2 or 3 or 4 massive pools that become bureaucracies. But I feel like knowing that that's a risk, there's a way to manage what's necessary for that issue versus just making behemoths that funnel money to their own preferences.
Yeah, I think that's a matter of defining the right governance. But that's all doable if there's a shared collective vision behind it. Again, I think there's also alignment between boards who effectively take the final decision and the teams managing the foundation and the grantees. How to make sure that the decision makers, i.e., the boards, have the right experience or at least the right knowledge to be able to understand what their teams are trying to push for, which can be things like shifting from short-term reach to more long-term systems type of impact. It's a totally different way of thinking. For example, if you come from the corporate business world, you think in terms of short-term market share, 3 month to 6 month type of thing, and it just doesn't work. It's not compatible with what we're seeing in the social sector.
And it creates an interesting recognition of a tiered power dynamic, isn't it? Because you have a power dynamic between the nonprofit and community, between the executional team of the foundation and the nonprofit, and then the board to that executing team. We've seen it both, right? Where the teams that run those funds are hamstrung in some ways by their boards against what their intentions would really be if they were trusted to deploy money.
I think that's really crucial. I don't know which type of form that can take. Is it much more capacity building and training for board members? Is it a certain types of standards for board level? I don't know, but there's definitely a gap there.
You think there's an aspect of that lies in the hiring practices for those foundations, like who they're hiring into those foundations? Do you think that is also part resulting in that problem?
Yeah, certainly. I think that does contribute to it for sure. If they would be hiring subject matter experts or previous practitioners or people who've been leading NGOs in this field, obviously they come with a different background and knowledge.
But there are plenty of crossover people. I think that's an important piece also here, right? We don't just live in a one-dimensional world of people that have only done company work and people that have only done nonprofit work. There is a big enough pool of which you and I, for example, are members that straddle both worlds just as easily. So it's not that it's an intractable problem.
No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah. So then maybe coming to the whole kind of how do you define impact, how do you monitor impact, etc. And I think there's really a need to shift from the current kind of worst case measuring just outputs, how many beneficiaries are reached, to best case measuring some forms of outcomes or how am I affecting beneficiaries, much more to what are we learning through this process, integrating feedback loops, defining the right process, the right spaces to encourage reflection, learning, and adapt accordingly. And for both partners, right, for the funders and for the grantee, having a bit beyond the outputs or the initial short-term outcomes. How well aligned are we with this 10 to 15-year vision? Are we gradually moving towards policy shifts? Are we gradually moving towards community empowerment or whatever the intervention needs to be? There are some emerging good practices of foundations that actually don't really focus on the typical reach, but really try to focus on what are we learning, how are we improving, how do we adapt, and how much progress are we making towards shifting the system. I think we need much more of that.
Yeah, because the way you deliver funding can and should evolve as you learn so that it enables or supports the evolution of the organizations and teams in your portfolio.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, as we said, right, it's non-linear, it's unpredictable. I mean, who knows how things will evolve in 2, 3 years in the current state of the world. So that you need those feedback loops.
If you are trying to work together in tandem towards an outcome, and if one partner is changing, the other partner needs to be evolving to keep up or enable that change.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. No, there are some good examples, and things are evolving. Huh? Of course, we're painting maybe a bit of a negative, but considering the size of the issues we face, I think we're all impatient. It should evolve.
It may sound like we're painting a negative picture, but the reality is this is the overwhelming view from the trenches, in a sense. This is the overwhelming view from the field of execution. And just like me, you've worked with, I'm sure, tens or hundreds of these organizations over your time and career. And so we do get quite a good viewpoint.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Touched upon it as well, but definitely something around this more segmented approach. So adapting your funding system to the maturity level, to the needs of your grantees. So having a bit more of a portfolio strategy, a funnel approach, a segmented approach, and tailoring your support to the specific needs, which can be, as we discussed a bit, right, the right ratio between unrestricted and restricted funding, the right ratio between financial and non-financial support, and the outcome should be also adapted to what you're trying to achieve.
This is a really interesting point you're making about segmenting, right? So when you're thinking about segmenting here, where do you see the need for segmentation? So because the alternate would be you just make sure you try and finance the same kind of player. So where in that continuum then is the value of having that segmented approach? Because that means you are funding different types of players in that system.
Well, I think where I'm coming from is my personal opinion, but what I'm feeling is there are too few mechanisms to help impactful but small scale interventions to become more impactful, let's say, to scale, basically. So I think that we need much more support to build this pipeline and to help them become more mature in order to reach scale at the size we need it. So that's where I think I'm coming from.
It's a capacity challenge, right? In order, yeah, to have the capacity to address the scale of need, realistically, you're going to have to invest in smaller organizations, improve their capacity to be able to deliver at scale, rather than trying to finance the creation of one or more governmental sized nonprofits that are then going to come with vast bureaucracy and other vested interests. So in that context, then you mean the sensible move in terms of the future of funding is that funders should be financing different tiers of organization so that they are in fact building capacity in that geography, in that ecosystem, so that the larger number of smaller organizations are able to move up the curve while you're potentially also funding mid-sized ones to get to a bigger role in the system and the biggest ones to really play an anchoring role around which these other organizations can function. So that's a really interesting paradigm shift that says, are we in fact funding across the different levels or different types of organizations so that we do have a robust sector for that issue?
Exactly. Yeah, with the right diversity, the right quality, the right levels. Yeah,
And
precisely.
then you need to segment your practices and support essentially to fit those different tiers of organization. Very interesting. Yeah, great point.
Another one which I think we still tend to forget is just to foster a culture of celebrating also success. And it seems obvious again, but linked to that also, don't underestimate the power of building a community. So these funders who support 10s, 20, 30, 50 grantees, usually all active somehow in the same sector or field because they maybe have a thematic focus. I mean, what a huge asset this is. You have numerous practitioners all trying to, in the end, address the same issue, maybe in different ways with different interventions. So nurturing this community, fostering cross-pollination, sharing of good practices, of learnings, of challenges, bringing them together and celebrating also success. So I guess the point is more around the power of the community and nurturing this community more than celebrating success. That's just a piece of it.
Yeah, so establishing a community within your portfolio and potentially across your portfolio with other portfolios.
Yeah, even better. Because in the end, I mean, these are all people sharing the same values, the same vision, potentially with different interventions. And that's another issue. A lot have overlapping interventions. So that's also something that funders could look at. How do I make sure I have complementary interventions rather than a bunch of people doing the same thing? So maybe that's also something. How to foster more of a culture of experimentation if needed, or at least ensuring you have sufficient diversity and complementarity in your portfolio and not too much
Yeah, that
similar.
complementary diversity, I think, is very, very important because almost all of these big complex issues are multifactorial. And if your portfolio doesn't, in fact, cover those factors, there's almost no chance that you will ever see any functional transformative outcome. Do you see that very often? Really well understood and well fleshed out portfolio strategies?
No, I don't see it often. And again, it exists, of course, but no, it's not yet mainstream. And again, I think it links to different items. In some cases, the strategy is just not clear. The need or the issue is just not clearly understood.
The more we talk about this, the more you can just see so much room for improvement in funding practices that you can just imagine the untapped impact that is just waiting. The current paradigm is that nonprofits need to be better. They need to be better funded. They need to be more competent. We need better solutions. We need more nonprofits. The paradigm is the nonprofit is where all of the potential lies. But actually, the more we have these conversations, the starker it becomes that the real potential lies in the funding ecosystem, because that's where all of these things have languished as compared to the operating sector, which has been under a lot of pressure to move forward and therefore does, but is also limited in its ability to move forward by essentially its dependency on these practices.
Completely agree. I think that's actually a great way to summarize or conclude the conversation. There's a huge untapped opportunity there, and there is a lot of money being channeled to the field, and there are some easy tweaks. I think we've discussed, some things may be a bit more cultural, require more time, but there's some easy tweaks of practices that can be put in place and would just make the whole thing much more effective.
Yeah, some of it's just philosophical, isn't it? It's not like it's costing you any more money. There are just a bunch of practice changes that could have huge follow-on effects.
No, agreed. Yeah, very exciting. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed this conversation. Lots of good insights. No, thanks for the invitation. I think it's really fun. I enjoyed it. And yeah, I get out with a lot of new ideas as well. So let's see how we can then follow up and hopefully make some of these happen. If others are interested, join the movement, reach out.
Absolutely. The future of funding. Let's go. But yeah, thank you so much, Loic, for your time today. Super illuminating. And as always, I learned some new things. I particularly like that idea of the segmentation. But yeah, thank you so much. And all the best with whatever exciting things are coming up.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed it.